I think that right now, because the technology is changing so much, right? Like, I think we do need to talk about the nuance of like the AI and machine learning technologies as we integrate them, because again, things are changing so fast that the like building heuristics or rules or ways of doing things is not as easy. And so I don't think that long term there will be such a thing as an AI product manager, right? I think like eventually it will just be a product manager again. I think it's kind of similar to when I was working on mobile stuff for Kayak, right?
Yep.
In that particular case, like we had, my title included mobile because we needed to figure out mobile. But the reality is like now, like there's not really mobile PMs as much anymore, right? It's kind of like digital transformation. It ends up just being like, we need to like now consider something new within our current context.
Awesome. All right. So welcome everyone to our LinkedIn live event. Today we have Chris joining us for the ProductHooman podcast, a LinkedIn live show. As he mentions himself as a chaotic, good product manager. So I have like pretty much a few of questions over there. But then just to give his background, he is a product manager. He has led in some of the amazing companies, some of the tech giants that we know as Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and now recently has joined in GitHub, right? Leading the AI pieces of GitHub, which we also know as one of the players who have given us the co-pilot, and how industry has also started talking about co-pilots in general. Chris has been in the forefront of technology and building products from a very long time. I have been following him from a long time as well. And let's quickly dive in and talk about future of product management. What does how does AI sort of plays the role, and how things are changing. So let's just quickly get started then. Chris, welcome to the podcast. And
Thank you.
How's it going for you today?
Good. No, it's kind of a hazy day here in Oakland, California right now, but thank you for having me. And yeah, I think like just to get this kicked off, yeah, my particular role is actually what we're calling a portfolio operations manager. And so that is, if people are familiar with product operations to me is really just like PMing the PM experience. So I still do product management, but my customer is a product manager rather than, say, the developer or development team. And so my role is to actually help the VP and his org that focuses on AI and productivity within GitHub. And so, Copilot is part of that. I can't claim any credit for Copilot because I just got there. So I just want to be clear about that. Like the team is amazing at what they're doing, and there's a lot of really like interesting things. I think the part that really made me interested in joining GitHub was the fact that I think GitHub is going to be at the center point for the way that teams work together. Absolutely. And from that perspective, I think all the work I've been doing with the Uncertainty project, which is like a community around decision making and strategy I helped co-found, like all of that I think needs software to be better at what it's doing. And then especially we talk about not just machine learning for code completion or creation, but also for the way we end up just manage the way we talk to each other, I think is really interesting. And I'm working on another like weird side project that's this employee manual of the future. And it's a design fiction about like an employee manual that you'd be given from a company 20 years from now. So anyways, I just think a lot about like team dynamics, organizational things, how do PMs really do the best job, which a lot of the time is just helping the people on their team understand what are the problems they're solving and how they can best solve them and deal with the trade-offs that they have to deal with. So that's kind of my role.
For sure. I think product ops is a very big thing in terms of when at least it comes to, let's say, big orgs where have a lot of people collaborating into the same place. I've been a design system guy for my product designers back in, so I can totally relate with one of the things that you're talking about, right? But just to begin with, right, as someone, like I've been a designer turned founder and come with a product mindset, right? And one of the ways of me explaining to a lot of people about what I do or what product management essentially would be is probably synthesizing the kind of data that every company or the product basically receives, and then removing those ambiguity and building something out of that thin layer, right? And when I was looking into some of your past sort of interviews as well, where you started talking up as the chaotic good product manager, tell me, like, if I am thinking right, is it like somewhat similar to what you also think? And would also love to deep dive into like how that kind of philosophy, or whatever the philosophy of being a chaotic good product manager is, how do you bring in that into, let's say, decision making, or having these team dynamics and in general the product management? And would love to know, like, if I am thinking right.
No, so, and I mean, I think like what's important to at least acknowledge here is that there's many different flavors of product management. And I think, especially when leaders find something that's successful, they tend to focus on that. And that's actually referred to as the dominant logic theory, which is that, like, if you're successful and you then take mental models and the way you think about things to apply them to future situations. And so that's why I think, like, you can see a good amount of variance in what people would say the product manager's role is because there's different things that they've seen successful previously. I think for me, really the three meta things that product managers tend to do. One is kind of help wrangle the uncertainty of the world, because there's that ambiguity about, like, trying to create something. We have to figure out, like, what are helpful uncertainties that we can take advantage of, that we can use to our kind of like strategic benefit, but also that we need to be resilient within. But then we need to, like, create certainties for people to, like, build something. Right. And so that translation point, that kind of like translation, I wouldn't say it's like reducing all uncertainty. I think it's like managing the uncertainty in a way that's really helpful. The second thing is like decision facilitation. A lot of the time we should be pushing to create more innovative, more kind of differentiated things for our customers to solve their problems. Right. And so in those particular cases, I think it's really important that we help make the right decision to weigh the trade-offs between the different types of functions, and not just engineering and design, but again, I always like to bring in like legal and security and privacy and all these different groups that end up like helping us weigh decisions and discussions around what is really best for the customer and what is best for the business, right? So that's the second thing, is this kind of like decision facilitation. I have a lot of thinking about decision facilitation and decision making, which we can go into more. And then the third one is really just this like building of alignment and communication of things. I think that's the last kind of thing that product managers do. They do this through, not only writing documents, but also like communicating status, like a bunch of that stuff. I do want to differentiate product managers from like project managers, TPMs, program managers that think more about like risk reduction. And we're on the other side of the spectrum as product managers for more kind of like innovation. And so there's no like, you don't go one side or the other. There's like somewhere on that spectrum for your type of business, your industry, the type of problems you're solving. You may be on the very explore kind of side, like much more focusing on experimentation, versus this idea of like, we have an established business, we just make sure we don't screw it up somehow. And that's like very risk adverse. And so I think that's like an important dynamic to say there. I mean, now, do I think everybody should be a chaotic good product manager? No, I don't think everybody should. Like, I think that's just something as like a hat tip to role-playing games and Dungeons and Dragons. That's where it really comes from. But like, but I think like, there's a value of having lots of different types of diverse opinions within a product team. And sometimes that could be across practice lines, like, again, product management, design, engineering, those types of things. But it could also just be mindsets, right? Like I've worked with other PMs that think very differently from me. And that's, I think, very valuable. And so I think, for me, I tend to be the person that is pushing for like, are we doing this the best way we could? Like, are we as effective as we could be right now? And this is an ongoing problem, right? Like, you're never going to be perfect. And so there's always something more, even for high performing teams, to continue to like improve on and just maintain, right? Because like, as the environment changes underneath you, or as the environment of the world changes, your team can drift into places that are bad. So I've worked with lots of high performing teams, and they almost kind of feel like, no, we're great. We don't need to deal with like retrospectives. We don't need to talk about like what is better here. But the reality is like, that is a recipe for falling into disaster eventually, if you don't think about that stuff. So yeah, but that's what chaotic good is, like, kind of, I'm that person that is trying to mix things up a little bit more. I include a lot of things like randomness, but I'm doing it in a way that I'm trying to do it better for the world and for our customer and for the business and for other people on the team.
For sure. So Chris, like, just to sort of, recap the whole thing, and I'm sorry if we had to do it again, but like what I was explaining was, as a product designer and myself, like the way I sort of explain a lot of people about what we do in product is basically synthesizing a lot of data that a product basically receives in general, right? And one of the biggest part of product people, or let's say designers in general, is to synthesize all of those data and sort of build something meaningful out of it, right? So just to sort of relate with this, and if I actually understood it right, would love to end by saying, when you say like chaotic good product manager, and would love to know about that.
Yeah, well, the chaotic good product manager is kind of a nod to role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that. And so I actually am writing a role-playing game module right now for something called Mothership, which is more of like a horror sci-fi one. But I just find like, maybe the thing about that is like I'm doing that because I kind of find writing different types of fiction to be really interesting. I just did a talk at Product World about kind of writing good fiction. But what it really means for me is inside this like alignment within Dungeons and Dragons, chaotic good really means that one, you maybe don't like really subscribe to any particular kind of system that you follow quintessentially, and that you do it for the good of people, other people, and for the world. And so in my case, like, I guess I'm constantly asking the question, are we doing this the way that is most effective for us, or are we considering everything that we should, or are we kind of adhering to biases or suffering from biases that we don't even know about? And so the chaotic good part of this is me actually trying to push the teams in those cases. But like we were just mentioning earlier, I think there's like a real value to having lots of different types of people on a team. And so like I wouldn't say that everybody should be a chaotic good product manager. I think that we should have some like lawful neutral. We should have like a couple other like if we want to use that kind of alignment structure. So I think like that's important, is that as product managers, maybe the three key skills, right? One is really this like wrangling of uncertainty of the world for the team. And even though you talk about like kind of reducing ambiguity in some ways, I think it's like reducing the ambiguities that are helpful for us to move forward with the project, right? Rather than kind of reducing all uncertainty, which I think there's no way to do that. And then two, like there's actually benefits to making bets that are unsure, because you'll discover something new. It also means you might fail, but I think that's the price of actually doing something new, is failure. And so I think that's the first thing. The second thing is like decision facilitation. And so everything I'm doing with like, I helped co-found this community called the Uncertainty Project, where it's all about decision making and strategy. That I think that decision facilitation is not done well today, I think, in most teams. Like you end up just like having a million meetings and spending lots of time kind of churning, when the reality is like we should be a little bit more aware of how we create the containers to have discussions versus decision making. What is the difference between like decision making and the communication of decision? We're probably involving way too many people in every decision is probably part of the problem. So I've been doing a lot of talks about that. And then the last thing is really just around like alignment and communication. So like how do we actually help the team understand what's going on and help them actually give feedback in a cross-functional way, I think is building of that alignment is really important. And so anyways, those are kind of like the three middle schools. I think like your point about like being the embodiment of the customer understanding. Yeah, I think that's very fair, right? Like, and I think like, the only thing I would say is that I think that is something that I've worked in cross-functional teams a lot of the time where we would have, user researchers. And so for them, I actually think they are more of like the synthesizer of customer need. But it doesn't mean that the product manager doesn't also in some way like embody that, right? So I think it depends on the team a little bit for that type of thing, which is why I kind of mentioned those three things as like more like meta skills or practices for a product manager. Because there have been times I've joined a team and I had to write all the user stories, acceptance criteria, like all the way down to like writing Gherkin style acceptance criteria. But then there are other teams where like the engineers didn't even want me in the task management tool. Like they wanted me to be doing like the higher level abstraction documents and strategies and stuff like that. They didn't want me mucking around with like what is the priority of these individual items, right? So I think that's the thing that is most interesting about product management, is that there are such a broad reach of the ways that this happened, or that it ends up working. I think like a friend of mine and an author I really admire a lot is Von Tan, who wrote The Uncertainty Mindset. And he also did a paper that I really love, which is called Negotiated Joining. And so his whole thing inside of the Uncertainty, like the Mindset book, is really about how like very high-end restaurants do their research and development, and the way those teams kind of innovate in very interesting ways. It talks about is this negotiated joining is where when you join a team, you may have a job role that is very vague in some ways. So like product manager, right, is a vague job role in some ways. There's specifics that you probably can do, or like in this role, we may think it's a very specific thing, but overall it's a very broad type of role, right? And so when you join, though, you try a bunch of different things, and the things that work you continue to do and make part of your job role. The things that are not valuable you discard and don't make part of your job role. And so just be a 90-day plan when you first join somewhere ends up being more about learning, in my opinion, than it is, and learning what you should be doing there. Not even just learning about the culture and the background of your product and using your product, but I mean, like, what are the things that are valuable here, right? Like, is engineering already dealing with certain aspects of the task management, right? Okay. Are the user researchers here that are actually embodying the kind of customer need and problem set? And so that's where, like, again, I think, and to look at our job roles as continuous experiments too, because things may change where we need to do something new, right? And so I think that's important. And that's what I learned from Negotiated Joining, which I think is a great paper if people want to read an academic paper about it.
Yeah. No, totally makes sense. I think if I had to sort of conclude with this, about being more, I would say someone who's moving things is someone I would say would be the chaotic good product manager. The idea is to be like, it differs, like as you said, right? Like it is impossible to be almost every time being unchaotic. Like when you are in a larger organization, but when you're in a smaller organization, you need to move things, or even when you are in a bigger organization, but you have sort of picked up a project which needs to be 0 to 1 mindset. I think at that point of time, you need to be more on moving things rather than sort of, like depending on someone and sort of figuring things out, right? So I totally relate with that. I think that is also kind of job that I also do on my daily basis, and sort of completely relate with that. And that, with that said, like, was also one of the reasons wanted to talk to you as well. Recently I think there was a talk where you said about AI product managers, right? Is it a myth or is it something that is coming up, right? And I totally get it. Like there is obviously a lot of things that are not defined in terms of the way we have seen, more traditional product manager where things are little defined, that you're moving towards, versus now you have AI where AI is sort of predicting things and stuff like that, right? So it needs a different kind of nurturing of your mindset in general. So would love to understand, like when you say AI product managers, who are those, like, and how are they different from traditionally what has been happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think that right now, because the technology is changing so much, right? Like, I think we do need to talk about the nuance of like the AI and machine learning technologies as we integrate them, because again, things are changing so fast that the like building heuristics or rules or ways of doing things is not as easy. And so I don't think that long term there will be such a thing as an AI product manager, right? Okay. I think like eventually it will just be a product manager again. Just like in that talk that you're referencing, I think it's kind of similar to when I was working on mobile stuff for Kayak, right?
Yeah.
Like, in that particular case, like we had, my title included mobile because we needed to figure out mobile. But the reality is, like, now, like, there's not really mobile PMs as much anymore, right? It's kind of like digital transformation. It ends up just being like, we need to like now consider something new within our current context. And so that's why, like, I mean, I think there is nuance about how we need to, and we've been trying to piece this together as we build things, but like, one, the data is very important. And that's not just like what data you have, but it's also like, how is that data collected? I think when we start to think about the fairness and bias issues, like everything that's blowing up right now with Gemini and Google, like there's a bunch of reasons why that type of thing happens, and how that actually, the mess that they're in now was because of a reaction to unfairness in distribution of data sets, basically. And so so that's interesting. I think also when we talk about like privacy, right, the data collection, if you don't do it under the appropriate like type of consent, and store it the right way and do things like that, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And so the data itself is now part of the product manager's job, right? And that's I think a very interesting thing. Second thing is like how it's trained and the way that we end up creating loops within the product. This is something that we should already do when it comes to like, understanding behavioral data to then make updates to the software or the service itself. But there's many different loops. Like there's very small loops, like every training iteration, but also the idea of like all the different model versions that we may create over time. And then finally the loop where we're kind of trying to detect drift of the model and actually look at user feedback on the way the model's performing as part of a system. That becomes, I think, much more important. So I think that's like the next nuance. And then the final nuance is like, there's just patterns that we need to deal with. And so like I was before I left Google, I was helping with an update of the People Plus AI Guidebook, which is a really great resource for, I think, mostly focused for designers, but also for product managers on how, like, the types of patterns in how you create services that allow for non-deterministic models or systems. And it means that you're building trust in different ways, or more importantly, like, you're really thinking about trust from the beginning and how much should the person trust this output, right? You're looking at things like interpretability of the information and what's going on. And so those things end up becoming different and important. And so those are the three kind of nuances that I try to, like, at least teach people about right now. And I'm actually working on a course for kind of like AI design patterns for kind of like product managers and designers, which we'll be announcing like in a month or so. But like, I think there's something like really important about those things that we need to get right, you know, and so that's what I'd say about that.
No, that totally makes sense. And coming to the point where you said like interactions are going to change, right? The way we're going to interact with machine itself is going to be, like a totally different kind of machines that we're going to operate on. Considering it will be like another thing, which is basically my thesis as a designer. I always think about, how, there will be a time where there will be a very thin line between you having a machine with you has like a computing power. With that, you're also doing your own natural things as a human and always I've seen AI as an assistant for you. Like it becomes like your seventh sense, right? Where it's like you're using that second brain to, sort of figure out, if I'm doing right or wrong, right? So those kind of decisions, something that you can give it to them. And I was also talking to Shivi as well in the last, sort of LinkedIn live that we went into, and we also touched upon this design patterns in general. What do you think is coming up? Like, I feel like what my thesis is that eventually we are going to merge. Like, for example, let's say with VR headsets, right? We are already moving without computers and having a computer with ourselves. And also we are not using a mobile, but actually like it's part of our body and using some of our own senses all together and sort of writing the new set of computing in general. What do you think eventually will happen? Like, what kind of patterns are we going to look at? One is obviously we have seen voices coming up, the voice interaction, the couple of AI pins that are getting built and stuff like that. What do you think those patterns are?
I mean, at the very basic level, human beings are very spatially oriented. Like almost all of the brain science about the way that we encode things in our mind seem to be very much related to that. We think about everything as like inside of a space of something. So like the reason why all of our analogies tend to talk about like motion and like location and things like that. So I think there is something very interesting about maybe so that's one thing that we should keep in mind, right? Like we're very spatially aware. That's why like placement of things inside of an experience, how things change over time in an experience actually is very meaningful. This is why like immersive technologies like virtual reality right now and even the stuff that Apple's starting to do with like the way they talk about it is like, the augmented reality. I can't remember, spatial computing, I think is what they're calling it now, but whatever that is, like I think there's something really interesting there. The other kind of interesting trend, I think, or not trend, but like aspect that we think of when it comes to like the way that human beings cognitively understand things is we also think an awful lot about people. And so what we do is, there's this concept of theory of mind, which again, I think like we need more research into whether that encodes into like the actual brain or not. But we probably think about, we start to build models inside of our head about other people. And absolutely. That's why like the Dunbar number of about 150 it ends up being there is because that's like our mental... It's what?
It's another kind of data as well. Like
it's another type of data, and it's also the fact that like we can only probably store about 150 other models of minds inside of our heads. Monkeys have a smaller number of those, but they still have a certain number, right? And so there's something about this like way of doing socialization and the way that we kind of work together requires us to model these things. Now, what that brings us to when it comes to like AI agents and other types of non-deterministic systems is that there is a spectrum between a tool and an agent inside of our head, of us, right? So the idea of a hammer, if you talk to people, they don't think about their hammer as like being an agent. They think of the hammer as an extension of their body when they're using it, right? Whereas with agents and autonomous groups, autonomous systems like that, they kind of like go off and do things and maybe come back and talk to you about it. And so there's a spectrum. And we're kind of like in a weird valley right now with some of this stuff, because you can ask something and it will synthesize human language. It will seem like it's a human being. And the Turing test was always like a very poor, it's because we can show that like clearly this thing is not intelligent. It's not aware. It's not conscious probably, right? And so, but it can fool us with synthetic language now. So I think like that's the thing, and even Don Norman talks about this, which in an interesting way, which he talks about like as cognitive artifacts, right? Which are some are beneficial and complementary. So like an abacus, if people learn how to use the abacus, they can actually do counting in their head in a different way than the people that didn't learn an abacus. And then calculators end up being like competitive cognitive tools in the sense that it offloads things to somewhere else. I don't think that's necessarily. I don't think there's like a valuative judgment here, because in some cases we want to offload certain types of work to other places, right? And that's the reason why there's like specialization. So, anyways, all of this like cognitive like science and neural like linguist thinking, spatial thinking, all that stuff, I think does bring us to this world that part of the reason why that people want to bring people back into the office is because there's something about this way that we end up like working with each other in physical space that is probably valuable. I think there are going to be abilities for us to deal with that in a way that is maybe more virtual. Like when I worked at Facebook Reality Labs on the Portal device, right, we talked a lot about social presence. And social presence is this idea of like, how much am I like, not thinking about the fact that we're on a call right now, and things like frame rate in our video and audio, even things like resolution, all those things actually help aid the suspension of disbelief that we're not in the same room. And so I think there's like a lot of work to do there. And then what does it mean for like return to office, I think is like really interesting. And then as a side of that is like, how should these agents, things that are more on the agentive spectrum of the world, how should they be presented in our world? Because right now, like ChatGPT ends up being this like disembodied website with a chat interface, but should it be something more, or should it be something less? Should it be more integrated into other tools? Like if you look at the way the Copilot works, right? Like there's a lot of different places that you can start to interact with the Copilot agent, right? I did a project a long time ago when I was at Philosophy, which is a design consultancy, where we're being hired by like Google and PwC to come up with like new ways of having AI agents work with people. And so we thought a lot about kind of multi-party chat, where it wasn't just like, it was the team. So it was like in the field service operations, it would be like a dispatcher and the field service engineer and, a warehouse person and a salesperson and maybe even the customer. And then there were like agents inside of there that were doing things as well. So I think that's the big question that we need to figure out right now is, one, is the technology good enough for us to now create more embodiment for agents? And again, I mean also virtual embodiment. Or do we need to kind of like integrate them as tools inside of these like systems that we end up having, like, like Copilot inside of Visual Studio, for example? Like I think those are really good questions to ask right now. And I don't think we solved this yet, right? Like I think there's so much to learn about these things but I think the future will be making some distinction between like tool and agent, and how those things show up inside of products will be a very interesting and hard question to answer, I think, for every product.
No, totally makes sense. I think there will be a phase of there will be a phase of adoption. I think that starts with something that is already there and that gets integrated with AI. And if we see things started automating or, just, being taken by something that the human was not supposed to do, but has been doing because of the grunt work, right? And yeah, I think we are in a phase we are starting to define some companies that are ahead of the curve, sort of telling us, this is what the future would look like. And in between, people are sort of still using the things that are already built and sort of starting to integrating these new technology to see what are the possibilities. I think that is what the phase we are in, and we have to look at a lot of things. But I'm the statement that you just said, like how Hammer is used sort of as an extension to your mental model to think about how interactions would be. So I'm taking that.
Well, and this is very much related to. I love referencing this paper by Parasuraman in like 96 or something like that, which was 1996, where a lot of like the research into trust and automation came out at that time, usually like in the academic world, aviation, or military. And so they were looking at like all the different cases where there were failures of using, say, like automated aviation systems. And it talks a lot about this idea of like the right level of trust, because with a tool, like you expect it to be able to work pretty consistently within like a very specific set of parameters. Like I probably wouldn't think that a hammer could break a rock, but I would think that it could drive a nail, and that I shouldn't use it somewhere else. Like I have a very specific model of the hammer, right? When it comes to these agentive systems, like you have to build a more complex model. You're almost building a model of what you think a teammate might do or not be able to do, right? Now it's not quite as, because like I think we want to dial back some of like the agentiveness of some of these things because we want them to be more like specific tools that are easier to understand. But whenever there's like even perceived autonomy, like there was it's like there's a lot of stories about soldiers actually naming and giving funerals for their bomb disposal robots, right? Like people name their Roombas. So there's like a lot of people that end up creating mental models of these things, even though they're highly deterministic. They're fairly deterministic for what they do. Like the bomb disposal robot is remote controlled, so it's not even an autonomous agentive system. Like it's just, and so I think there's a lot of things that humans do to try to make stuff more understandable. And I've been, previously, Philip Van Allen was a teacher at Art Center, and now is at a place in Europe. Why am I blanking on it right now? But he did a lot of work around basically animistic design as applied to AI systems. And animistic design is basically how do we personify these things enough for us to be able to understand them and build mental models, but it's not personification to being a full human. So the difference would be like I did a lot of thinking about this from the standpoint of like home automation. And so like the lamp probably I should be able to speak to the lamp because that's the way I like to communicate, or I should touch a button or whatever that is. But then the lamp probably doesn't talk back to me, right? Like it's not like Beauty and the Beast where like everything in the house is like singing and dancing. It's more like it acts like a lamp. And so that means that it can turn the light on and off. It can adjust the brightness. It can adjust the color maybe, right? It can blink. Those are all things that I expect a lamp to do. And so from that perspective, when I'm engaging with this technology, I expect it to act in some way. And so a lot of the things I'm writing an article about this kind of how do we gather expectations from non-technical people to talk with technical people becomes really important, because like you can use kind of I've adopted things like empathy mapping to do that for agentive systems, or the idea of like role play where one person role plays the system itself. User, so the user and the system role play together as two human beings. Like you discover so much about like what you expect, at least right now, from that type of thing. And so this, of course, changes over time, right? Like there's norms, people get used to technologies. There's skeuomorphism, which is another kind of interesting term around like how do you build something that is like a bridge to the next paradigm, essentially. So all those things go into this, but I think we just need to do a better job of like that technical to non-technical translation is really important. And I think actually the systems that are like today, all of the large language models, because they're able to do kind of like translation and summarization in very interesting ways, I think those tools will change a lot in the way that we communicate with our teams in the future. Because, once you make a decision, you may have a very lengthy document that was about the decision. When you communicate that out, you want to communicate it in such a way that people can understand what is the decision and the impact on them. And so in some cases, there may be no impact. And really the thing is, it's just like, hey, we solved this problem this way. 2 sentences. That's all you need to know. You don't need to know anything else, right? Like, but then there's for the people that are like, hey, this is going to impact your work in these different ways. Like, that becomes really valuable to then have that translation happen. And it means that maybe the product manager doesn't have to write like 100 different versions of the email. They kind of like dial in certain parameters. They tweak certain ones that are really important, but otherwise like it ends up being kind of automatically translated. So I think that's really interesting to me, is how to start using the like summarization and translation tools. And eventually we can even talk about how we no longer have to, maybe right now someone will write like a conceptual document, then a PRD or spec that gets, an engineer starts like spiking and working, then they create an engineering design document which is kind of their summary of what's going on, and all 4 of those things are completely out of sync from each other, basically. And so is there a way that we could start to at least like have automatic annotation? Like I don't fully expect that we're going to have like PRD to working system type of stuff perfectly, right, in any way. But at least if we could annotate like, hey, some changes over here in the code mean that this part of the PRD is no longer valid, right? Like that type of thing I think is very interesting and potentially very valuable to teams to be able to stay in sync with each other, right? So those are some ways I think the future of product management are changed by this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the world will be much more better when, like the last example itself, right? Like engineering bringing their perspective, there's business bringing their perspective, their designers bringing their perspective, and then that it has been given to a system that understands broadly what the topic is, and then helping you sort of figuring out, okay, this is what engineering is talking about, this is what it is, the business is talking about, and this is what the design is talking about, and here are the patterns where you guys are combining with, and these are the edge cases that like the different teams are looking at it. I think
well, and that goes that then goes to like trade-off discussions, right?
Yeah.
Which Von Tan created this method called Boris, which is really about like identifying trade-offs and then basically in some way resolving them, because there's a certain point that you have to say that we're going to actually do the better thing for the product this time.
Correct.
And the less good thing for the sales team, and that's okay. We identify that, we've argued that, but then there's gonna be other times where we say like, actually we need to do the special work for this one client because we're a startup and we need to do this, and so that trade-off ends up being something that's like very powerful and then leads to strategic thinking in a lot of ways. So like as you start to see patterns of trade-offs, that is essentially your strategy, right? But we rarely write it down, and we don't have good ways to kind of see across all the decisions that are being made inside of an organization what are the patterns of those decisions, right?
True.
It's very hard to do that, at least. So I think that's something that's very interesting.
Yeah, that also seems to be a gap there in terms of managing these products in general when you are in scale. but
that's why product managers are like in so many meetings. That's why they're trying to talk to so many people. So we're trying to get like sense make. We're trying to sense make this like environment that is constantly changing, right? And I think unfortunately it ends up being put on product managers too much when the reality is like engineers still need to communicate. They still need to like be able to find a middle ground with non-technical people. Maybe they have to have translators or something like that. But the reality is like, I mean, I've said this before, and I've gotten in people have raged against me online, but like I don't think a requirement for a product manager is to be technical. I think actually there are benefits to being technical in certain teams.
For sure.
But I think like overall saying that a product manager has to be technical ends up meaning we're like cutting off huge like groups of people that could be amazing at this job and could actually help create great products.
No, that's true. And like with that said, like any like in your last stint with Google, right? Any good sort of product that you worked at, and like any great project that you worked at, and you want to sort of give us some learning from there. Specifically, let's say on the AI advancements that Google has been doing, and maybe you have been part of it, and yeah, like one of your favorite projects, maybe we can deep dive into that just to understand how you were thinking as a PM, and you love the outcome, whether it is bad or it was good, whatever it is. Would love to sort of deep dive into your perspective of how you were solving these problems as a PM.
Well, yeah, I mean, I some of the stuff I can't talk about from the Google perspective, but like, I mean, maybe a really good example of like a failure that happened for me. That
would be perfect.
Yeah, and so like one of the things that I worked on when I was at Facebook Reality Labs with the Portal device was, so my role there was to look at identity with these like communal devices. So when we talk about identity like inside the Facebook world, that's like the Facebook account, right? Or the WhatsApp account or something like that. But the problem is that when we're talking about these devices that are in people's homes, like you have to log in with an account, but then anybody in that home could use it. So it could be my kids, it could be my mother-in-law, it could be a guest, it could be someone that's coming by to clean the house, like whatever. There's a bunch of different people that end up like interacting with this device in some way. And usually it's very rudimentary stuff like playing music or timers or something like that. But we also build things so that like in some cases people have built like Alexa apps to be able to check your account balance and stuff like that, right? So like there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. And I think the big problem that we were trying to solve was how do we reimagine identity within these communal devices so that it's more in line with the expectations of the technology for the people. So the fact that my kids will go up and play music, and then when they play music on Spotify, that behavioral information is now included in my account. And so it then changes my recommendations. And so like for a while, my kids were playing a lot of like Minecraft satire music, were destroyed basically with this stuff. And so like that's a good example of where there was like a mismatch in the way that we were like actually collecting behavioral data to then use inside of like AI systems like recommenders and stuff like that. And so the thing we tried to do is, I was also owning the biometric recognition programs for this device, so that was going to include like voice and face, and so more to like do personalization. So there was a funny story where apparently when the Portal device first kind of started getting used inside of Facebook employees' homes for like dog fooding and stuff like that. Because like everybody kind of uses Facebook there as like the way to connect with people. Now there's workplace and stuff like that, but like a lot of people were friends with Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook, right? And so a kid would go up to the device and kind of see the device and then just be like, oh, I recognize this person, I want to call them right now. And so Mark Zuckerberg would get like calls from people's kids basically. And so the way they dealt with it, and this was before I joined, they dealt with it by like actually creating a block list. So like, I don't want this contact to show up. Right. But that still meant that if you had like on average 500 friends on Facebook, you still had like 500 things. Yeah.
Yeah. How would you go and sort of do
That's
it
right.
for?
That's right. And so like part of the work that I was, and then they created favorites, which meant that there was like a short list of these. The part that still was kind of weird is that it still looked like it was like if my son called my mom, his grandmother, right, it would still look like it was me calling. And so we try to think about this idea of like a household. And what would it mean for the Butler household to make calls and stuff like that? And so we ended up creating a dog food of this. And we did some surveying and some user research. And we just found that people were not getting the concept. And so, like, I think it still is the right way to go. I think long term, there needs to be a different identity modality for these types of devices. Like, I think, but I think it was really hard because of the way that we were setting up the device in the first place. For people to get this concept of the household. And so I think part of it was like terminology. I think part of it was they were just never, this was like a brand new thing that we were going to be doing. Like no one had done this before, basically. But I ended up leaving before we could finalize a lot of that product. But at least at the first iteration of that thing did not work out in the way we wanted it to. Yeah. And then eventually, as public information, like, Facebook ended up canceling Portal for consumer use. And so, anyways, I'm very sad about that. I love the TV device. Like, I think it's a huge missed opportunity to not have video calling as part of the biggest screen in your household. But I expect Apple will do something like this sometime soon. And then Google just honestly never really had the network, right? Like Facebook has the network, Apple has FaceTime and that network. But Google, again, like you had some work networks, but I think from a personal network standpoint, it wasn't there. So there was like some interesting strategic differences. But then also people didn't trust Facebook, right? Like people didn't trust having a camera device by Facebook in their home for a good number of people, right? So anyways, that was kind of like a failure. And so anyways, I think like the next iterations that were going into that was to kind of like rethink the way we introduced the concept, to rethink some of the terminology we've been using. And then, I think also, honestly, some of this, people don't have to learn it first. They just set it up so it's correct, or as correct as we can get them to set it up. And then we make sure that they don't make mistakes, right? Like that's the thing that you need to do. I think that we would have gotten there where people would have socialized and understood. Like I actually started to become an advocate for what I'm calling slow setup, which is that when you put something in your home, you put it there and it sits there for years. Like it doesn't change rapidly. Like if you put in a bookcase, you probably put in some books and some stuff first, but then it kind of like evolves over time what goes into that bookcase, right? Like you'll get a new book, you'll get a new picture you want to put there, whatever that is. And so I think from like a paradigm standpoint, we should be trying to allow people to get started with the things that they want to do. Like again, for these types of devices, it's listening to music, it's doing timers, it's maybe video calling, right? And so get those things set up as fast as possible, but then everything else, like you do over time and you allow them to adopt over time in some way. And so I think even just getting, now there were a lot of like legal security and privacy issues. And so I was working very closely with that entire team. Right. So there was just like a lot, anyways, it was a very complicated product. And it was just hard. I don't think we got it right in the dog food iteration that I did there.
I think it totally makes sense. I mean, this sounds like scale product, right? Like you're talking about a product that's been used by millions of users. They have their own perspective. They have their own ways of. It's not even about how good the product you're building. It also comes with a lot of baggage and other stuff as well to even start innovating something like this.
That's right. Well, that was the joke at Microsoft, right? Like the biggest competitor to the last version of Office was the last version of Office, right? And so it was so much that like it was not even about like you'd have to train users, IT would have to manage a different set of software, and so there was just like a lot of inertia against making these changes because so many people do. I mean, when I was at Hotmail, just maybe like a really short funny story was like, we were updating the branding to go from Hotmail, which was Hotmail was orange originally, and then with the MSN branding, it was blue. And so we tried to roll out a new version with the blue branding, and basically it failed, so we had to roll it back. And we then got a bunch of like emails, some of which like some people were like, "Hey, I really liked nighttime Hotmail, which they thought the blue was rather than the MSN branding. And can you bring back? And other people were like, I really disliked the fact that it was blue. Can you bring back the orange and blah, blah, blah. So like people didn't even understand what was going on because we, one, didn't do a good job probably of like talking about that. But for things that are so massively used, like the idea of huge releases between things is really bad in some ways. Like you want to evolve the system over time.
Correct.
So that people are not actually kind of like taken aback by the change that's happening. And so that's really hard. That's hard to do well. And so I think that's why there's so much kind of like inside of the scale of large organizations, it takes a lot of work to kind of like continue to move your customer base like that. And it's hard. It's really hard.
No, that totally makes sense. And by the way, on this very topic, right? So last couple of weeks, you would have seen that Google is showing this on the top that there's a new experience that is going to come in. And, like people did get access to the new one, and then they started posting on Twitter and stuff saying, what was this all hype about? It was just a sign in that it was just changing. I was like, this goes to the basics of products like Google or Microsoft, which has a lot of users. I think this is just being responsible. I remember this classic story of eBay as well, right? Where they were just changing the color and they took a lot of time to just introduce that one color. But yeah, I think it's just being responsible with the kind of users you are dealing with. But yeah, with that said, like one of the things that I would love to understand is, let's say, there are a lot of PMs that might be working, being a 2-people team, 3-people team, and maybe just go, let's say, a 10-people product team, right? And that means it's pretty, like it would be a 200, 300 people sort of stakeholders that they might be talking to in general. How do you think, what would be a good strategy for a PM to sort of introduce something like, hey, by the way, we are thinking about introducing AI, where we think these are some of the use cases that are coming in for a product. And, considering there would be stakeholders that would be like, be more resistant. And even I'm also talking about companies that are huge, which has a product management segment, but they are into, let's say, retail side of the things, or let's say some very slow moving industries in general. What do you think would be a good strategies to sort of introduce something like this to their stakeholders? What would that process look like?
I think targeting reduction of errors is much more important than, I mean, like, yes, there's like a hype train right now about AI, and if you don't have an AI feature, you're considered to be out of date or something like that. But I think like maybe the story that I like to tell about this is that when I was working on something called Complete Seating, which was like an open table competitor a long time ago, we were doing a lot of like really interesting stuff with the way that we were managing the dining room floor. And so we could, back then we called it, I think, restaurant business intelligence. Today we would call it like restaurant AI or something like that. But we were doing a lot of work to not only predict like how long someone was going to sit at the table, but then like how table combinations can be used over time to do a better job of like high utilization, and you wanted to maximize turns per table within that industry. We tried to do that, and I think we got to like the first like official version of the product was probably in the 90%-ish case for like accuracy. But because of the errors that were there, people didn't trust the system. And so they would then like lock in a bunch of different things that would then cause the adverse effect that we could then not adapt the dining room to kind of like movement and stuff like that, or like fluidity. And so I think in that case, what I learned was that for these types of things where you are building a new technology that is potentially iffy, like trying to take over everything is actually a bad strategy at first. And the reason why is because you're probably going to get it wrong. You're going to burn a lot of trust. People are going to, in the case of the Paris-Surman paper I was talking about, where it's like humans and automation, where it's like use, disuse, misuse, and abuse. This is actually disuse is the case we're talking about here. Right. And so like people don't trust it enough, so they don't enable it, or they actively disable it in some way. And so I think in those cases, like you need to, as a product manager, you're there to solve a problem for someone, and you should be hyper specific on that. And I think generally when it comes to AI systems, other than maybe very early innovators, like if you look at a lot of the like image generation services that are out there, or video generation services, they're really pretty interesting now, but they were really bad for a while. And so it was like early innovators were like willing to muddle through that. Yeah. But when we're talking about like the people that were probably still using stock photos from large providers, they were not. right? And so maybe they could use automatic touch-up type of services, but they were not willing to like really be an early adopter to that type of thing. So I guess one thing that I think is like a model around this is like actually looking at the errors that people make and creating models that will at least stop a certain percentage of errors, right? Like if you needed to with those types of AI systems, you could say like, only if we have like a confidence level above X, we will actually try to stop the error. But then we continue to like monitor and observe how well we're either not or doing these other cases. And so over time, like eventually by reducing all errors, you end up doing what the human would have done anyways, right? Or you do it better than the human, and you can then automate the things about the human. Now, within that field service operations project I told you about previously, like we did a lot of research about how people felt about the system. And there were certain parts of the job that they definitely wanted automated. Right, like they knew exactly what the system was doing. They trusted it to do that maybe, and they didn't want to do that job. But there were other things like interacting with human beings, like helping a customer, like being kind of that person on the phone, helping walk someone through. They still liked that part of the job, actually. And so I think there's like an interesting thing about like what are humans like best at and like to do versus what are humans really bad at that maybe they don't want to do. And so like doing that distinction I think is interesting. So error correction or error reduction I think is always like a good first step for this type of thing because it leads you to collect the right types of data. It leads you to actually build more trust with your customer and things like that.
Correct. No, that totally makes sense, and you won't believe this is something I've written down over here where I just wanted to ask you something like if you have to give me a difference and just for people to understand, what would be a difference between, let's say, human intelligence decision making versus artificial intelligence decision making, right? Like, can you give us some example and probably let's go deeper into this, right? Like, what would be the difference between these two, and what are we perceiving eventually as an output from both of these different kind of mindsets?
So, I mean, I think that at the very highest level, there was like a slide from 1979, I think it was IBM, where it says that like basically machines can't be responsible, so they should never make management decisions. And I tend to agree with them. And so like the truth is that I think like when we talk about decision making, we really are saying that there's like some amount of automation that is taking place. But I think a human being should still be the person that is like being aware of the problems or trade-offs that may come out of that. And so I wrote a short story like that was for the Mad Scientist, which is like in the U.S. Army military like blog, and talks a lot about kind of like randomness in decision making. The truth is that even when we automate even weapons of war, there's still a human being that is making the decision to deploy those things. And so for those cases, right, like we should still assume that human beings will be part of certain decisions that will be made. Like there's a lot of regulation that's being proposed right now about like how healthcare systems cannot automatically reject people for healthcare claims, which I think is really valuable because like, again, the moment you start to automate these things and make it so horrible to try to like get an exception done, right? You're creating new horrible bureaucracies and calcification of process, which is really bad. So I think that's the thing, is that the difference between these things, and I'm not going to get into like whether this is conscious or not and like that type of thing. Like I think we don't even know like why humans are conscious, right? Like that we still have a lot to do when it comes to like just understanding ourselves. So I would say like the key aspect should be that we as humans believe that we have agency. We have a legal system that is set up to believe that people have agency. I don't think that we should allow for as much as like a corporation doing things as a group. I also don't think that systems should do this. And I think actually maybe when we talk about like how do we regulate this type of stuff, there's already regulation in place. It's called the FTC or the FCC or the Food and Drug Administration or any of these things that are like just using US agencies for a second, right? They regulate all types of things that are about the outcomes for people, right? And that should continue to regulate whatever ends up happening for these systems. Now, new and more horrible ways of doing automation may be created, but the outcomes should still be regulated in some way about that, right? Like if we're saying that like because of this new system, it means that like insurance companies make it so it's impossible to actually ever claim anything, there should be some regulation that like, hey, what percentage of claiming should actually be able to go through, right? Like, should we require that there's like new ways of getting pre-approvals or like, you know what I mean? So I think there's like things that are more about the outcome itself rather than the technology. So that's why like I think the Biden kind of paper, the thing that came out from Biden and his office about like regulation, like the fact that they include like maximum number of flops for a processor to train a model, I think that's a mistake, because like that's just like that's like such a weird kind of like detail rather than the outcomes that we're talking about here. So that's what I'm saying.
Correct. No, this totally makes sense. I think at the end of the day, there has to be humans in loop. And I think what you just said in the first line itself is that you cannot just give robots to take decision for you. And yeah, I also believe that with the fact that it has to be more of an assistive job rather than replacing your brain with taking those final decisions at the end of the day. With that said, right, like since you've worked with some of these amazing companies, is there any sort of research insights which are like very common and sort of, let's say Google is working on, or let's say Facebook is working on, which we have seen like as a behavior coming up, considering you guys sort of at the end of the day you have a large user base that would teach you on a very daily basis. What are some of the patterns that you're seeing now in for, like, let's say anything that is interesting that came out of any of the research? It's out of Facebook or Google or anywhere that you worked on, and you've seen like, okay, humans are changing this way. What would that be? Like any favorite one that you have seen, or you want to talk about it?
I mean, I think like when we talk about the impact on how people do things, I think there's some interesting kind of assumptions that people make now about the like type of information that they have access to, and I think the goal of, say, like Google search results for a very long time is about trying to find something, but there's a big discussion about what is truth that comes up because of the fact that like just because a website says something, it doesn't mean that it's actually accurate. Maybe it used to mean that, right? But now it doesn't. And then I think with the most recent thing about kind of Google image generation not including, or being not historically accurate is probably the most polite way to put that. Did we expect it to be historically accurate, I guess, is the first question, right? Because these are systems that are not meant to, like, they're at best lossy compressions of the data that they end up creating, right?
Yeah.
So from that perspective, like, what are the expectations of some of this technology? I think we need to have a much bigger conversation about that, because if we expect it to create, like, if we ask for like the founding fathers of the United States of America, right? Like, that's fine. There's lots of pictures that are out there already. So why should we generate one? And if you ask it to generate something, then maybe you shouldn't expect it to be fully accurate in some way. And again, I'm not trying to, again, Google has to have a reckoning about like a lot of these like values that they hold for this type of stuff. And but that's the thing I think that it comes down to, is that I think this argument or discussion about the way that people utilize this technology will be a very important one going forward. And so anyways, I think that's super interesting personally. I just don't, I can't tell where we're going to go with this, but even for people that are, like my kids' age, they're going to grow up in a very different world when it comes to, like, what does it mean for when I was growing up? I kind of didn't really, I was an early adopter of the internet, definitely, because of just who I was. But like the fact is that them growing up in a world where you don't know what content is real or not is going to be very interesting. Because before, when I was growing up, we would assume that everything was accurate, basically. And so I think that's, again, and maybe the generation even before me, like the fact that they had like encyclopedia books in their house, and that was like the truth of the world, when like, again, there were probably lots of inaccuracies and probably like one-sided views on the way things were there. Outdated, exactly. And so they're having a reckoning about like, okay, well, we can't trust anything. And it's like, maybe it's just like, maybe just postmodernism is going to postmodern. Maybe that's the issue. But like, that's I think the big thing is, I think technology does not have enough good discussions about this inside of teams. And actually, when I was part of Google, there's a group called Moral Imaginations that's out there, and they have like a paper that they just released. But this idea of kind of, how do we have better discussions through even like speculative fiction, and then do role play to really talk about like, what is the impact of the technologies that we're potentially building? Use that to make better valuative judgments, or kind of like judgments or decisions with the use of our values inside of product teams. And those are discussions that need to take place and just don't enough in today's like corporate world.
No, makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah, I think even like recently I saw this reel, okay, where this mom is basically interviewing the dad and the child, and like basically the mom was asking like, how do you write? So the person basically shows as action like this. His like the kid's dad was basically doing like this, whereas the kid was doing like this, like showing the keyboard instead of writing it, right? So, so I mean, the world is absolutely changing, and they don't have like really don't have any idea about where the humans are coming evolved, like where are they evolving from and stuff like that. So this totally makes sense. I think a lot of things are going to change, and we are going to go question, is this real or not? I think that is going to be the biggest problem as of now.
But I mean, but again, people like, even with like really rudimentary photoshopping tools, people still believed the fake stuff that's coming out of that, right? Like I think there's like a bunch of things about just like societal questions that we need to answer as well, which is like, how do we want the culture of discourse to work, like say in political realm, right? Like, are we happy with the way that, like in the United States system at least, there's a huge kind of gap between people that maybe used to work together, like the left and the right, being able to work together in some way, and how kind of like radicalization of this type of stuff happens. So it's really, I think when we talk about the fears around AI and machine learning and even technology, they're really societal fears is what they are. And it's just that technology enables them in some way. And that, the people's values that end up creating technology are embedded in the technology. So anyways, that's what I would say. Is like, I think all those things are true, and it means that we need to like have more discussions about that, basically.
No, makes sense. Makes sense. All right. So with that, right, your recent transition on GitHub to GitHub, and just wanted to understand like, what was the motivation? What are you looking for? And like in general, how's the team? And would love to understand why did you choose GitHub?
Yeah. So again, the team is really great. Like there's a very interesting kind of cultural thing going on because they're owned by Microsoft. And so I guess I'm now back at Microsoft after, oh gosh, it was probably like 15 years or something like that. So I'm back at Microsoft kind of again. But no, I've really loved working with everybody so far. I mean, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of stuff going on, and it's a team that is doing an awful lot right now. And so that's very exciting. I would say like the reason why I moved to GitHub is one, I think like, the software that they're building is really at the center point of the way that teams work with each other. And so I think right now they're very focused on development teams and in particular developers. But I think like the longer term vision is how do we kind of help all, like if everything is going to be in some way technologically oriented in the future, like we're all going to have to write software, right? Software is eating the world, like that type of thing. If we believe that, then GitHub has the opportunity to be at the center point for the way that we work together with anybody, right? Like, and so I think that's really exciting. And then the other aspect, like the portfolio operations that I'm doing as like basically product ops here with the group that does AI and productivity, is that it's a very exciting time because I want to help them really do the best job that they can. But I think longer term, the things that we end up doing inside of GitHub need to now become part of GitHub, right? Like we use GitHub to build GitHub. And so from that perspective, like there's a lot of things that we could build. I mean, again, there's always about trade-offs, like who do you target as far as your core customer and stuff like that. I am personally an advocate that we end up including more of the cross-functional team. Right now, we're mostly focused on developers, but I think as time goes on, I think there's something really valuable and exciting about that. And I think we'll be differentiating because it's not just engineers building by themselves. They're working with a whole bunch of people to actually build something. So that's something I'm a huge advocate of. And so that's why I'm really excited about GitHub, is I just think like all the things that I've been talking about when it comes to like decision making and strategy, I think there's like an impact on the way that we not only do that as GitHub for building our products, but potentially like how do we eventually build these things into GitHub in a way that's like helpful. So that's what I'd say.
No, that is like pretty interesting when you said that there are a couple of other team members that also sort of is part of in the product building journey, right? And it's important that a lot of other people sort of come in, and it's not just engineers building the product. I think that sounds very exciting in general. But yeah, with that said, I think I'm in the last fun section of this whole podcast. So these would be like very quick questions and gonna be like
Sure.
rapid fire. So get ready
Okay.
for that. Cool. So yeah. So if you could only use one AI tool for the rest of your career, which would it be and why?
Well, it'd be Copilot, of course.
It's okay. It's okay.
I mean, honestly, I don't have a good answer for this because I don't think any one tool is great. But I do appreciate, I think also just I've been using ChatGPT for a bunch of different things. And when I was inside of Google, I used Bard and things like that. But I use those systems for, I think this idea of like getting helped with writing is very interesting to me. So I think any of those systems that end up helping with writing, I think is great.
For sure. All right, so imagine AI has just authored a book about your life. What's the title like?
I mean, it has to be Chaotic Good Product Manager. I think that's probably the easiest one. But I mean, I think also we could use what my motto. My motto is like, we are wrong today. We just don't know how yet. So
That's amazing, man.
That's what I think that's what it'd be titled, probably.
Got it. Cool. So what's the most unusual but practical advice you have ever received, and you want all of us to probably think through it?
I'm trying to think of like what would be unusual about advice I've gotten. I mean, I think
or maybe best advice. It's fine if it is.
I mean, I think like what's counterfactual a little bit is that as I've gotten like more tenured in my role, I think much more about the people than the technology. And I think people end up really focusing a lot on the technology, and they want to be like technically proficient. They want to know everything about their product. They want to know that completely, when the reality is like it's actually the people and the teams and the customers that really matter much more than that. So I think that's the thing that I think I've just and maybe this I think back to a manager I had at like this company called Dash Navigation way back in the day, Mark, and he would always kind of advocate that like when you get into a meeting, think about like what are the positions or needs for each of the people inside that meeting. And rather than like just going in there with like, here's the agenda I need to get done, it's more about like, what is the viewpoint for each of these people, and trying to integrate that is actually super valuable. So I think that's like, that's the advice I got, and now over time has kind of turned into this like, it's about the people, not the technology.
For sure. And what's the one thing that you absolutely love about your job?
I mean, I just constantly love figuring things out. And so that could mean like creating something like my goal is to have someone say like, hey, Chris helped me with this thing without me prompting them, right? So that idea of like figuring things out both from like a people and process and technology standpoint, I think is really exciting to me, especially because we're constantly we're figuring out new things with the technologies that we're using and working on. So that's why I tend to work on earlier stage stuff, is I just like love figuring out the new rules, right? That's what I really love about my job.
Perfect. With that said, I think I enjoyed a lot talking to you. I think this feels like I've been reading all your stuff from such a long time, and now I'm sitting with you and sort of talking to you. So thanks. I'm like super thankful and grateful for you to come and join the show, and hope you also enjoyed this.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me on. I'm really, it's been great to get all the great questions you have. If people do want to connect, I'm always happy to connect on LinkedIn. And like I said, I mean, I guess the things that, like, I'm part of this uncertainty project, so people should subscribe to that. I don't write everything there. Like, I've been, like, slacking on there. But, like, that's one place. And then, if people need help with, like, decision-making, strategy, any of that type of stuff, I'm also happy to have, like, a conversation about it. So if people want to reach out to me, I'm happy to do that.
For sure. With that said, thank you so much for joining the show, and thank you folks for joining in, and see you in the next ProductHooman podcast LinkedIn Live show. All right, bye-bye.